Hey guys, Mr. Backenberg here. In this video we're going to take a look at some other types of inequalities. So in this first example we're going to look at solving an inequality that has a radical in it. So notice there are two parts to my inequality on the left hand side. There's the x minus 3 and the square root of x plus 1. To find our critical numbers, or our important values, I'm going to take each one of those and set it equal to 0. So if I start with the x minus 3 and set that equal to 0, I'll have to add that 3 over to the right hand side. So I'll get x equals 3. And then if I deal with my radical, if I take the square root of x plus 1 and set that equal to 0, to get rid of the square root, I'm going to square both sides. So then it's just going to say x plus 1 equals 0. And then I'll subtract the 1 over to the right hand side, so I'll get x equals negative 1. Now I'm going to use this to start building my sign chart. Now as we're checking whether these intervals are positive or negative, if I start left of negative 1, so say negative 2, I can safely plug negative 2 into this first one and I'll get a negative result, but I can't safely plug negative 2 into my second value because I'll end up getting a negative number underneath the square root. So left of negative 1, this is actually undefined. Now if I plug in something between negative 1 and 3, so maybe 0, if I plug in 0 to the first factor, that'll give me a negative result. And if I plug in 0 underneath my radical, that'll give me a positive result, and a negative times a positive will give me a negative answer. And then if I plug in something to the right of 3, so maybe 4, if I plug 4 into the first factor, I'll get a positive result. And if I plug in 4 underneath that radical, I'll get another positive result. Positive times positive means we get a positive answer here. Now as we're looking at this inequality, we want to look for where it's greater than or equal to 0. So that means where it's positive. So we're going to be starting at 3 and working our way out to the right. So that 3 gets included because our inequality has the equals to line in it, and we're going out to positive infinity. But there's actually another place where this inequality was equal to 0, and we found one of those zeros from that second factor when we set that equal to 0. So this inequality is actually equal to 0 at the value of negative 1. And we can prove that because if I plugged in negative 1 in my first factor, I would get a negative result. But if I plugged in negative 1 underneath that radical, I'd get 0. So anything times 0 will be 0. So also, I have to include the value of negative 1 as part of my answer as well. As we take a look at another example, we're going to look at solving an inequality that has an absolute value in it. Now notice this one is a rational inequality, meaning that it's a fraction. So as we're looking for our critical numbers or our important values, we're going to set the top and bottom equal to 0. So if I set my numerator equal to 0, I'm going to get a critical value at x equals 2. And if I look at that denominator with that absolute value of x plus 3 equals 0, we're really kind of concerned about where the denominator is going to be undefined. So it would not be safe for me to plug in negative 3 in that absolute value. So these are going to be my critical numbers as I'm setting up my sign chart. So now if I start checking signs, so if I plug in something left of negative 3, so maybe negative 4, on top I'm going to get a negative value. And on bottom, if I plug in the negative 4 inside of that absolute value, I'm going to get a negative answer, but when I take the absolute value of that, it's going to turn positive. So if I have a negative divided by a positive, then this is going to give me a negative result. If I plug in something between negative 3 and 2, so maybe 0, on top I'm going to get a negative result. And if I plug in 0 on bottom, I'll get a positive result, and when I do the absolute value of something that's positive, it stays positive, so negative divided by positive is a negative result. And then if I plug in something to the right of 2, so maybe 3, on top that'll give me a positive result. On bottom we'll get a positive result, but we have to do the absolute value again, so it's going to stay positive. And positive divided by positive is positive. Now as we're looking at our inequality, we're looking for where it's less than or equal to 0. So I see two negative intervals, but we have to remember that our fraction was undefined at the x value of negative 3. So we're really going to have an interval that runs from negative infinity to negative 3, and then a separate interval that runs from negative 3 to 2. Now the negative 3 is not included because if we tried to plug in negative 3 on the bottom of the fraction, we would run into some dividing by 0 issues. But the 2 is included because if I plugged in 2, that would actually equal 0. So we put a bracket around that one. That's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching.